The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 11. Spacely tells George his stagnant business needs to diversify. He's desperate enough to ask George for an idea. Realistically, Spacely gets the idea first because he's the one with experience with the company. He gets an idea for a dinosaur park. George says the dinosaurs would eat the people watching them. And somehow Spacely didn't think of that. Somehow he thinks putting up a sign for the dinosaurs would keep them from doing that. George somehow doesn't tell him that an air dome around the dinosaur park would be better to protect people, and smartly flatters him by saying he should name the park Spacelyland. He needs to advertise it to get people to know what it's all about with a name like that. He's arrogant enough to like the idea, and says that rebuilding the dinosaurs from their DNA isn't realistic. Somehow he tells George to build him a time machine by Monday to get them. He just wants an excuse to fire George because he knows it's hopeless. George seems to tell Spacely he's a crazy idiot, only for it to be revealed he's just telling his family what he should have said. Elroy says no one's ever made a time machine and says he can't make one, and apologizes to him. Fortunately, George says he and his family will trick Spacely into thinking he's time traveling by dressing up in costumes and making scenery. Elroy agrees to make a pretend time machine too. This seems like a less unoriginal plot. It's forced that George says he's not going to reveal who will play the dinosaur to maintain suspense for the audience. In universe, he has to mean the audience of the park. But there's no reason he'd think that if he told his family this, the audience would find out. Why would the writer think we would care who's playing the dinosaur like it matters? Judy apologizes to her boyfriend for calling off their dates because she's fortunately more loyal to her dad than him. Eventually, after boring panels, Spacely calls George and gets invited to his house for dinner. Spacely said he had a great meal. George lies to him that the time machine he's in was programmed to stop at various points in time, and that when he'll hear his voice in there, it'll be a recording. There's no way he'd be fooled, because he'd still be able to see that behind George is the same wall and giant windows and floor, which wouldn't exist back in time. Someone mentioned the word scenery, so scenery would have been used to block the windows. I guess they couldn't afford it, but I'd rather have good writing. I thought this was going to take place in a fake jungle. There's no point even going through this charade, because obviously Spacely would go on to try to sell the time machine and fire George for fooling him. Since Spacely would need some intelligence, or he wouldn't be able to run his company, it only makes sense if Spacely knew this was all a charade, and was playing along because it was entertaining. He doesn't even question seeing the cowboy knight in the same room as the supposed Cleopatra, and George calls this a time distortion. Why did George bother juggling if he's bad at it? Why did he have Judy start singing if he knows she's bad at it? So many of these panels give me nothing I want to talk about. Elroy's been in charge of shaking the box Spacely's in. Predictably, George dresses up as Fred Flintstone. Spacely doesn't say it's weird that all of these supposed past people are speaking in modern English, when George could have told him the time machine translated them, and altered his brain to make it look like they had proper lip syncing. And for no reason, George says he'll smash the bonds. But then he tells me he's leaving the caveman days. So he wasn't actually going to, and he just wanted an excuse to scare him. Spacely says he hasn't seen the dinosaurs yet. George would remember that, so he wouldn't have told him this. He says there was a technical difficulty, and now he's coming back to the caveman days. Somehow Spacely asks the so-called cavemen where they keep their dinosaurs. I'm proud of the writing when Elroy says cavemen didn't exist until after the dinosaurs. How's that a common misconception in the future? Somehow Spacely doesn't ask how a mere cave boy would know this, when cavemen are only restricted to tiny areas. Still, this has to take place in a different universe from the first issue, where the Flintstones was in the past. This story is too frustrating to be entertaining, but it thinks it is just because of the characters being in costumes. If Spacely can hear George talk to him from outside, and he thinks it's a recording, There's no reason you won't hear him ask Elroy if he has the lizard and ask where the magnifying glass is. I know he's shouting when he gives him the fake recording, but he's right on top of the box, so he'd hear him. He uses a magnifying glass on a lizard to scare Spacely into fainting. The next morning, Spacely tells him he's given up on the dinosaur park, when he wouldn't be at the park, so it wouldn't matter how scared he is of them. Sadly, he doesn't reveal that he was just playing dumb, and instead tells him to show him where Blackbeard buried his treasures so that he can get rich. He'd only say this if he wants an excuse to fire him. He would fire him for George and his family hitting the box he's in with swords pretending to be pirates. Spacely says Jetson wanting to be let out of here, and the only reason he'd think that he could hear him would be if he knows this is all a trick. Because if the box was really in another time, George wouldn't hear him, and if he did, he wouldn't let him out of the box because then he'd be face to face with pirates. It's too bad this is the only hint that he knew this was a sham all along, because the story sucked the whole way through for not explaining that right away. And this alone doesn't prove to me that he always knew, because I could have just realized it. At least this plot is better than a rip-off Jurassic Park story, because it's more creative. But I can't help but feel like if I actually saw them go to another planet with dinosaurs in it like I expected, it wouldn't have been a terrible story. You'd think dinosaurs with their long strides couldn't be outrun by humans because they're bigger than them. But dinosaurs might not even care about trying to eat creatures so small unless they were starving. So if it was explained that they were too full and weren't impressed by how little calories they'd get from them, it could make sense that George would survive being near them. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 12. Jane asks Judy how school was, and Judy tells her they're learning about the Back to Nature movement of the 60s, where some people gave up everything to get back in touch with nature. I hate that she said, "we're inputting," because it makes it a bit confusing to read when she already said some slang. She's interested in the fact that people used to grow their food, and wishes they could get rid of gadgets and do things naturally. How are they not still growing their food? Even if they grew it in a lab, they'd still say they were growing it. George comes home with something he just bought and says that with the push of a button, it projects the sights and sounds of a relaxing, natural environment to suit your mood. He summons an illusion of a tropical waterfall, and Judy storms off angrily. After time is wasted, he's asked if he's been to the beach, and he somehow says he's been to the surf simulator, when he wouldn't think that'd count. Why would Jane smile while reminding him that he got sick? I can't relate to Judy when she complains about this cool technology. I'd rather see her get sent to the 60s and see how bad it was. She says their food product is sent to machines that simulate the taste of something they never ate, and they can press a button to get something, and another button to get rid of it. Her complaining causes George to take them on a vacation. Jane says they should stop and get supplies from a store, and he humors her. Someone at the store says they're gonna need more than a guidebook if they're gonna walk around the alien planet, and Judy turns him down. He tells George to take his card just in case, and George thanks him and gets told he delivers anywhere. Judy's happy to see some trees, and in 2 panels she's seen squatting mosquitoes, while Jane says she's not used to walking for a long time. She thinks rain is cool. I refuse to believe she lives in a world without rain. Obviously no one would survive that. They hide under a tree which gets hit by lightning right away. I'd expect Judy to be the one saying that was cool at this point, but she's scared too, and instead it's just Elroy because he likes excitement. All of them get excited at seeing a tiny, harmless-looking rabbit, and Jane says they're stranded yards from their car, which is also stupid. Jane offers George her cell phone, which she brought in case her friend called. So George contacts a delivery aircraft to get a hairdryer, snack dispenser, automatic sonar, insect repellent, and the most vague thing, a bioreserve backup unit. George pays by credit, and there's a forced ending where they're all in a big translucent blue tent wearing silly clothes for no reason, when the insect repellent would have been enough to protect them. The Flintstones and the Jetsons, issue 13. Someone tells his chauffeur to stop the flying car because Astro is the dog he's been looking for. I have to assume George made the conveyor belt stop so that standing on it wouldn't send him falling. He gets asked how much he wants for his dog by a collector. So apparently, Great Danes are extremely rare in the future, somehow. This guy called Mr. Crew somehow thinks he could pay someone to give away their pet. Astro gets tempted when he tells him he'd get a life of luxury. He gives George's card and tells some hired tough guys to kidnap the dog. At least he tells them to try the easy way first. This is such an outlandish plot, and not in the good way yet. Elroy turns them down, and you'd think he and Astro would hear them talking behind them. Their car crashes into the ring around the roof near them, and they tell their boss they failed, causing him to call George. Why is he wasting time trying to persuade George again? Why does he make it so obvious that he's gonna get Astro one way or another when that could just get the cops sent after him? Judy already knows who he is because of TV, not that it matters, and George thanks Jane for giving him a gift. Why does Jane think they shouldn't worry about Acru? He calls Astro a rare Scooby-Doobish hound as he's holding a photo of Scooby-Doo. He's asked why he won't just ask the dog to come live with him. Someone tells him about the Animal Liberation Act of 2019, somehow passed by the United Planets, making it so that the animals have the right to refuse the companionship of any human he wants. So he shakes his hand, calling him brilliant, and every day after that for a while, Astro gets gifts delivered to him. Elroy's sad because the gifts changed Astro. He doesn't want to go to the park and chase meteorites anymore because all he wants to do is lie on the dog bed and wait for the delivery boy. That's not believable, because that would be boring for him. Then finally it turns out the Jetsons have a buzzer, and a video call from someone tells Astro that a crew wants his company for dinner. Astro ends up at the restaurant and gets lied to that George offered to sell him to Acru. He's a pretty smart guy. Acru at least puts in the effort of petting his back to reassure him and says he deserves better. Astro agrees to go to a big building that has a lot of collections. Out of nowhere, he tells his hired thugs to put Astro in a cage. George ends up putting on weight because he hasn't been spending time on the treadmill without Astro. And he tells Elroy he could go visit Astro. Why did it take him days to think of this? Elroy would have demanded that the first day. All George has to do is effortlessly go to the building Astro was taken to, and a machine tells him where he is. This would have been avoided if he didn't know where this place was. Why did Acru tell him that? Someone tells George that a crew's never here and robots give the dogs what they need. Out of nowhere, Astro's able to push the cage door off effortlessly because he has super strength in this issue. That's stupid. I thought the protagonist would need to put in some effort freeing him. Astro's happy to see them and Elroy hugs him. Elroy tells Astro that George never sold him because somehow it's illegal to sell animals. Which would have to mean that everyone gets their pets from off the streets. Astro hugs him, and Elroy asks some other dogs where they would like to live. And George is confusingly happy at having to walk all those dogs at once on his conveyor belt. And this is another universe because we'll probably never see them again. This frustrating story, somehow it spacely acts like he believed he was getting sent to past time periods when George and his family were talking to him in modern English in thin disguises, when they could have asked their family members he didn't meet to pitch in instead. And they didn't even make fake scenery like a play to hide the fact that they're still in George's apartment. This story would have been fine if Spacely was given a thought bubble as soon as possible, revealing that he knows the time machine doesn't work, but finds their act of fooling it to be so entertaining that he's happy to play along to see what's next. Still, you'd think you would punish George for showing him a lizard under a magnifying glass, which you would have heard him talk about. This story is about Judy wanting to get back to nature because of school history lessons. Since it's annoying that she complains about the awesome technology around her, it's satisfying when she and her family hate the mosquitoes and rain after they humor her. She doesn't complain one bit when George has some gadgets delivered to them for it. It was fine, but it was too predictable with barely anything done with him being out in the wilderness, as it was all just the most typical expected problems. This story was about a collector trying to get Astro with hired thugs. It's a boringly simple, repetitive story where the low point is him trying to persuade George again, even though he should have known better. It was impressive how he was smart enough to succeed. He got Astro to go to dinner with him by just asking him, taking advantage of how he's got human intelligence. And he lied that George sold him to him to get him to agree to go with him. His plan would have worked if he had been smart enough to not tell George where he was going to keep Astro. George didn't even have to try to get Astro free. He just walked right into the building with no security system keeping him out, was told exactly where he was for no reason, and Astro burst out of the cage himself. The story was tedious, because it wasn't believable. The hired thugs gave up after the first failed attempt, instead of being a believable story with variety where they tried to catch Astro in a bunch of traps. And the plot only took advantage of it being in the future with an outlandish law to justify a crew being allowed to get Astro from him. It looks a lot better compared to a horrible episode of the show that's very similar to. Because in the show, it's all about a stupid forced trial scene, where eventually he gets the dog, and the guy somehow has enough of a heart to let them get their dog back after everything he did. But it was still way better than the episode of the show because it's a lot more interesting, with a lot more variety in what happens in the plot.